Paul, you looked after the orchestra and the BBC singers for nearly 20 years, I think.
23.
23 years.
Well, 23 for the chorus and the orchestra and 10 years for the singers.
Right. You've been with Elliot Gardner?
Yeah, that was the job I did, I guess, immediately. Well, not immediately beforehand. I worked for John Elliot Gardner as general manager at the Monteverdi Choir and Orchestra. Right. And it wasn't really a good fit. I wasn't right for the job, and we had, if you like, different sets of values. And so I just decided to cut my losses and leave. And I was doing bits and pieces for about 6 months, bits of consultancy and what have you. And then the BBC Symphony job came up, and I went for it, and I was interviewed by Roger Wright and Sir Andrew Davis, and a wonderful HR lady with a fabulous name of Nadine Lynch-Bloss. Very good. And I got the job and started in 1st of March 1999.
Before you joined the BBC, what was your musical training?
I trained at Trinity College of Music. I went in as a pianist for my undergraduate studies and a composer, and then I did a postgraduate year composing and conducting. Yeah. And I worked for a couple of years as an accompanist. And then I made the decision to stop pursuing a performing career and to move into management, or move into the administrative side of the job, if you like. So I did bits and pieces of freelance work, doing some touring with various orchestras and high school groups coming over from America. But my first full-time job was general manager at the Academy of Ancient Music with Christopher Hogwood, and I did that for 5 years, which was a job that I really enjoyed and learnt such a huge amount. And we did lots of recording. We toured all over the world, in North America, South America, Japan, Australia. Then I went to IMG Artists, and I worked with... In the first instance, I was there working on their large-scale arena concerts with people like Jose Carreras and Jesse Norman and Kiri Takanawa, Placido Domingo. And I was there for 5 years, and then I left and I went to Scotland to join the Royal Scottish National Orchestra as chief executive, based in Glasgow. And that, interestingly, was a little bit like the Symphony Orchestra, only their dysfunctionality was much greater because they had a complete falling out between the orchestra and the management and the board and the Scottish Arts Council and Glasgow City Council. So the Glasgow City Council had frozen the funding. The Arts Council was in despair. The orchestra board didn't know what to do. The orchestra had set up its own board. It was a complete guddle. It was a right old mess.
Right.
Anyway, I kind of knew that. And so I went in and...
So you like a challenge?
Well, I do like a challenge, really. And I just think that, in situations like that, it's either going to go out or up. It can't just stay as it is. So we built lots of bridges, and Glasgow City Council reinstated and increased its funding. And so, if you're the right personality, building bridges is not difficult, and creating confidence in the orchestra, confidence in its management, bringing the management team back into the fold as well, because they were completely disenfranchised. It was a very difficult time for them. And a lot of them were feeling very low and very bruised by the whole experience. And so that was, if you like, my role there. Yeah. And I did that for 4 years, and then I was lured back to London with this job at the Monteverdi Choir and Orchestra. But and it's funny, sometimes I think, well, do I regret having done that? I kind of regretted leaving Scotland because I loved living in Scotland. Mm. But then I came down to run the Montes, and that didn't work out for me. And then the job at the BBC came up, and funny enough, I'd heard that it had been filled. And I talked to Roger when somebody said, "Well, no, I think it's still vacant. I think something's happened and it's open again." And he said, "Well, if you want to put an application in, you better get a move on." So I did, and the rest is history, really. So I stayed, and I stayed 23 years.
And who was in the BBC management at that stage? Who was running the Proms, for example?
Nick Kenyon was running the Proms. Roger was running Radio 3. John Drummond had gone. Yes, the Director General. Yeah, Mark Thompson came after Greg Dyke, and so we've been through, and then Tony Hall, yes, which was a very good period for us, and now more recently, of course, Tim Davey, who I first met when he was director of radio.
Okay, so you come into the BBC at a time when it's reasonably healthy. There are people at the top who care about classical music.
When I arrived at the orchestra, I arrived at the beginning of March, and the planning for the season that was about to start in end of September, if you will, was almost non-existent. It was sort of skeletal. So the first job that I had to do really was to program the season. So what I brought, I guess, was my knowledge of the repertoire and of artists to program that first season, and then took, if you like, the artistic lead on the orchestra for the next 23 years, sort of shaping it and taking it into directions that it had not been in before. So they were just coming to the end of the 98-99 season at the Festival Hall. They were about to go into Proms 99, and then the following season, 99-2000, which coincided with the orchestra's 70th anniversary, which nobody seemed to have picked up on or noticed. So I made sure we had celebrations there. But those took place at the Barbican, so because when I joined the orchestra, I moved the orchestra from the South Bank, where they'd been resident more or less since it opened in the 50s, 51, to the Barbican.
Now, that was a very different sort of concert hall, not really large enough for large works.
Which hall?
The Barbican.
Well, it wasn't really. It wasn't suitable for certain large works. So things like, Gurulida, or really enormous choral works, Mahler 8,
Yes.
Belshazzar's Feast, things like that would be more or less impossible to do at the Barbican, because it simply didn't have enough space on stage. And if you brought the performers forward, then the sightlines became problematic. What it did have, in my view, was a better acoustic. It felt more intimate, and we were operating alongside of the LSO, if you like, so there was a much more comfortable fit. Whereas at the South Bank, there was the LPO, the Philharmonia, the Albenberg String Quartet, Raymond Gubby and all his concerts and everything else. So by the time we got I was going to say pick of the dates, by the time we got offered whatever dates that were left, they really weren't very interesting.
But was it your idea then to move to the Barbican?
Yeah, I knew Graham Sheffield, who was then artistic director, I think, or head of music, something like that at the Barbican. I'd known Graham for many years, and Graham and I had worked together when he was at the Barbican, and I was managing the Monteverdi Choir and Orchestra, and he wanted to know if John Elliott would like to have a residency at the Barbican. And John Elliott said, no, he didn't, thank you very much. So they didn't. But I mentioned this conversation to Graham when I moved across, and I said, look, I don't suppose you'd be interested in having the BBC Symphony Orchestra relocate there. And he said, yes, that would be, let's do it. And so we did. And I've never regretted it in all that time.
The Festival Hall in those days did have a lot of defects, didn't it?
Yeah, acoustically it sort of worked. It had that electronic acoustic system, which,
yes,
for better or worse, was what it was. And it was... I go out on a limb and say I don't think the sound is better now, but it's fine. The reason I moved us was simply because we couldn't obviously create a sense of our presence there, because our work wasn't being prioritised, and it was being squeezed in between, and we were being mostly looked for to provide everything that the other orchestras didn't. So they wanted lots of new music from us and lots of composer portraits and things like that. And
yes,
in terms of presenting a balanced diet for the orchestra, then it was very important that we had the space in which to do that, and a place where the artistic programming of the venue was holistic across the whole year, which it very much was at the Barbican and still is.
So you were welcomed at the Barbican. It was a fit. Yeah.
Yes, it was a good fit. Yeah, John Tusa was happy that we were there. Whether Nick Kenyon was, I'm not sure.
Right. When
he came on as managing director, but nevertheless, we were well ensconced then, and we did I think bring a lot to the Barbican's offering.
Now you're based, or you have been based, or you were based, shall we say, at Maida Vale too. I mean, in a sense, you had two homes, didn't you?
Well, it's funny, the Barbican, we were never allowed by the London Symphony Orchestra to call ourselves resident at the Barbican. We were only ever allowed to be associate orchestra, and that was fine, but that was where our concerts between September and May happened, and then at the Albert Hall. So our home base, if you like, was Maida Vale, Studio One.
which is a rather dead acoustic, if I remember rightly. You have to sort of add things to it.
It's a difficult acoustic because it's very difficult to get to hear yourselves, very difficult to balance, to get any sense of colour and finesse because it's just too loud. It's a terrible place really, but that's why they're building the new studios over in Stratford.
Now, what are they going to get when they get to Stratford? What sort of place is the BBC?
Well, it's an interesting question because the disadvantage, if you like, from Maida Vale, Maida Vale had 7 studios, and some of them were drama and some of them were rock and pop. But the Symphony Orchestra and Chorus had their own studio, and the BBC Singers had their own studio. Now, in the Stratford, the Symphony Orchestra and Chorus will have one main studio. The Singers will have to share the next studio down with rock and pop, which is going to be a challenge. And although this is radio, you can't see my inverted commas. It's going to be a challenge.
Yes.
And then with a variable electric acoustic. And then the third studio will be exclusively for rock and pop because it will have a reverb of about 0.5, which is more or less like Maida Vale 3.
What's the Barbican's reverberation?
I would say it's about, I don't think it's more than about 1.2. It needs more bloom.
Yes. The Albert Hall would have plenty of bloom, I think.
Yes. One of the problems with the Albert Hall is simply being able to hear it because everything's so far away. But it's by no means a terrible acoustic. But the new studio in Stratford should have state-of-the-art acoustics, which should be able to bring it up to about 1.4, 1.5, which would be perfect for the big string repertoire or being able to accommodate and record both commercially and for the BBC large-scale choral works.
So you'd use it for recording as well?
Yes, at the moment our commercial recordings, for the
yes.
most part, when we're recording, let's say, for Chandos, who are our main label, we either go to Watford, and that's forever being closed for renovation and one thing and another, or Fairfield Hall Croydon, which has a very good acoustic. And we used to go to Walthamstow, but that became insanely expensive. Occasionally to churches like All Souls Tooting, St Jude's in Hampstead, but the idea is to be able to do everything in this studio now.
Let's go back. When you first arrived, the orchestra was in good heart, was it?
No, not at all. I mean, in a way, that was part of the attraction of the job, really, was that there was a big job to be done to repair a lot of relations within the orchestra and between the orchestra and management. They had, for whatever reasons, and I genuinely don't know, there was a vote of no confidence by the orchestra in the management, and it all had gone so pretty horribly wrong. It was quite toxic, really.
Really? Interesting.
And also the orchestra had a reputation for being difficult and abrasive and awkward and mouthy. And, there's always a reason for these things. You need to sort of dig down and find out what's really going on in order to make it like that before you can turn it around.
So huge challenge when you arrived.
Yeah, but that makes a job in a way more interesting than just coming in and, thinking you're just going to make nice programs and things like that. Changing the culture, to my mind, is, if I can be so bold as to say this, is the greatest achievement that we as a team managed to do.
Yeah.
We changed the culture within the organisation, which has enabled everything else to flow and to succeed. But when I knew what I was taking on when I took it on, I'd had a similar experience at the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. And that sort of cultural change, if you like, and repair job, if you will, and consolidation and growth, that's a very interesting aspect of any job, in my view.
Were you able to change the culture without changing the musicians?
Changing the culture is never a sort of lateral process. It's not one thing. No, it's a whole combination of things.
It takes a lot of time.
It takes a lot of time. It's about creating, if you like, you want to create a culture where communication is open, where values are clearly articulated and are consistently applied, where people are listened to, people are told when it is inappropriate to behave in certain ways, and basically where we are all really on the same side and not against. It used to be, in the old days, the sort of them and us approach, where, for example, if the committee or the union was seen to be getting too close to management, then it was thought they weren't doing a good job. Whereas, in my view, I worked very, very harmoniously and successfully with Danny Mayer, who was the union steward for many, many years, still is. between us, we headed off all kinds of issues and situations. And, some members of the orchestra, you have to help on to the next stage of their career, if I can put it that way. And, the kind of culture of aggressive behavior in performance, bullying, that really needed to be addressed, and some people had to go. Some of them went voluntarily, and some went naturally. In a way, if you start to change the culture, then people who are in one camp start to realize that perhaps there isn't a place for them. They can either embrace the new world, if you like.
Yes, exactly.
Or continue to fight against it, and that's rather exhausting. There was some touring, not as much as they wanted. I mean, when I first joined the orchestra, I had a full orchestra meeting, and I said to them, okay, so what's the problem? What's wrong? What do you want? Mm-hmm. And they were very candid and upfront, and in those days they would be very forthright. They had no filter whatsoever. And so over time, we had to invest in communication skills, if you like, training. But they just said, well, we're stuck in the studio. We're doing endless studio concerts and studio recordings. We don't get out and about. We don't do enough touring. The projects aren't that interesting and conductors aren't that great. And so you just think, okay, well, you sort of listen to all this and start to formulate it. Now, I coming in necessarily brought new relationships, people that I knew, conductors I knew, artists that I knew, things that I was interested in developing within the orchestra, recording relationships. And also at the time I joined, they had just appointed, or just about to appoint, Leonard Slatkin as the successor to Andrew Davis as chief conductor. And on paper, that looked like a good appointment. It was a relatively high-profile conductor, lots of recordings, a distinguished history with British music. In actual fact, it didn't work. The chemistry just wasn't right. There were certain issues, certain technical issues that were nobody's fault. I mean, the orchestra very much liked Leonard, who's a very nice, charming and interesting man. It just wasn't the right fit. He had 4 years. He had 3 years and then a 1 year extension. Yeah. And then we made some new appointments.
Andrew Davis, though, had been popular, hadn't he?
Oh, yes, and still is. I mean, Andrew had been terrific, but he'd done 11 years and he'd been at Glyndebourne and he wanted to do something different. And so he was offered the job at the Chicago Lyric Opera. Yes. And he's been there, for 20 years and done a fantastic job.
But he still has a conductor emeritus?
Yeah, conductor emeritus. Yeah, or conductor laureate. I forget what the title is now, but he is he's somebody that we very much like to see, and he still is, in my view, one of the most underrated conductors that we have, because his repertoire is so broad, from all kinds of new music and through Tippett, Mozart, Strauss, Wagner, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, you name it. Andrew's done it and done it wonderfully.
Yes. Now let's talk about the orchestra's remit, in a sense, and how it fits into the BBC's musical structure, if you like. What's it there for?
Well, when I joined the orchestra, I'm just trying to think of, if I tell a little story just to give an example. When I joined the orchestra, it was in the days when you used to advertise concerts in panels in the newspaper. And I noticed that the marketing team were putting our concerts in, but they weren't putting in the new music. And I said, why are we not doing this? And basically they said, well, if we list all that, then people don't come. So I went to Roger and I said, look, Roger, this can't continue. We have to, this is our USP. This is what we are here to do. And so if you like, my arrival and my relationship with Roger was such that we were able to sort of, if you like, refocus. It didn't need a massive change. It just needed a refocus of what the orchestra was for, which was to do a lot of new music, commissioning, rarely performed music alongside of the core repertoire. And that was always what would make us different from orchestras outside the BBC and justify the BBC in having us, having their own orchestras in that. In the days when the BBC, valued public service broadcasting, as it were, then the repertoire that we did made Radio 3 very distinctive, and that in turn made the BBC very distinctive. And that was, what what the powers that be were looking for. And it suited us very well, or suited me very well, I think, because it gave the orchestra a sense of mission and a sense of purpose and a clear understanding of what they were there to do.
Although obviously it had been slightly more austere in a sense what it was playing in, say, the 70s or the 80s.
Yeah, very much so, I think. And for the, if you like, the balancing act always is between providing that which the market doesn't provide. So that's very much the public service broadcasting remit. Being honest with your audience and saying, this is what we're here to do. And therefore, the people that come along for a whole evening of Magnus Lindberg or a whole day of Jimmy Macmillan or whatever it is are there because they want to be there. Yes. They're not there under any kind of false pretenses. And balancing that up with concerts which are perhaps more likely to gather a bigger audience and which are good for the mental, physical and musical, spiritual well-being of the orchestra. So being able to play Mahler and Shostakovich fabulously alongside of the pride that they took in delivering scores like, Burt Whistle's Earth Dances or Brett Dean or Mark Anthony Turnage, whatever it was.
George Crumb comes to mind.
Well, that's right. I mean, the orchestra takes a pride, and it still does to this day, in being able to just get its teeth round those pieces.
They're very good sight readers, aren't they?
They're very good sight readers. They very quickly assimilate and understand the technical challenges, and then if there's any music to be found, they'll find it and they'll make it. And that is what makes them such an extraordinary asset to the BBC, and indeed to the musical landscape, if you like, of the UK and the world. And we have a great reputation as a result of that.
What do you think the orchestra's view of itself is? Where does it see itself fitting? Does it say we are a world-class orchestra? We are, Yeah,
it used to have a very particular approach, which was a rather sort of arrogant one, which is that they didn't like young conductors coming in because they thought they should go and learn their trade somewhere else. They thought they should be the best and that they should have, Haitink and Dochnani and Mazel and Abado and all these people coming in conducting them. So it took a while to sort of get the orchestra to take a pride in what they were there to do and to see their place in the grand scheme of things, which was probably the finest broadcasting orchestra in the world, in my view, and in that of many other people. And that's something to be really proud of. And that came through, a long, slow, steady change of diet, musical diet.
Yeah. Now, it's fit today with BBC management, with whoever decides on the music, the musical output from the BBC today. How does it fit with them? Do you think there's still the same public service remit, if you like?
No, not in the slightest. No, I think the latest incarnation of management is, in my view, the most difficult that we've had to deal with, because there is a sense that the performing groups, particularly, whilst on the one hand they might think they're jewels in the crown, mostly what we're considered as a cost centre, which nobody really knows what to do with. They really do not know what to do with, and they don't really like to trust the people who know about things. So, for example, the latest music review was undertaken by two people who know nothing about classical music, reporting back to two other people who know nothing about classical music. And, you wonder whether or not there's some bigger, rather more sinister plan beneath all this. So the value of what we do and the value of what we are is not widely understood outside of Radio 3, I would say, in the Proms. It's a very difficult proposition because with people who don't understand the value of it and don't want to know the value of it necessarily, and it's a bit like government, they can only measure that which they can measure. Qualitative measurement is not of any interest.
Yes. Price of everything and value
the
of
price
nothing.
of everything and the value of
absolutely.
nothing.
Okay.
I mean, my time at the BBC Symphony Orchestra, 23 years, I was the custodian, the steward, if you like, of the orchestra during that period. It was mine to grow and develop. It wasn't mine to unpick and disintegrate. And in my view, the current management have a similar responsibility. It is not theirs to unpick and disintegrate. It's theirs to foster, nurture, and really value. Yes. Yeah. And if they can't afford to run all the orchestras they have, then that is a different proposition and a different question that needs to be addressed directly rather than by a process of slow, painful attrition and
Sure.
extinguishment.
Now, at the moment, you've got the Proms, and in a sense, nobody can. It's a bit like the NHS. Nobody can say anything against the Proms. The Proms are.
Well, the Proms has its own challenges, about
Sure. Yeah,
facing them from internal BBC.
Well, okay. Let's look at another issue, which is the money that you can raise as an orchestra. Is that becoming more of a thing?
Well, the BBC has recently decided that the performing groups, certainly the English performing groups, need to earn more money in order that the BBC can then spend less on them. It's as blunt as that, really.
Yes.
The challenge of that is manifold, really. One is that the impact of that on the marketplace is going to be substantial, because the Arts Council funded orchestras have very, very highly developed fundraising and development structures, which we do not have. They are all after the same quite small pot of money, which is available either through corporates, individual or trust and foundations. So if there are then 5 orchestras added into that pot, that's not going to go down well, in my view.
If they're made to be more commercial.
If they're made to be more commercial. We don't have the structure. We're not given any additional funding to recruit staff, to find sponsorship, to find commercial funding. And so it's an ill thought through strategy that's rather, we'll find that extra money from somewhere. And it's that fluffiness that came out of the last review that was just so deeply flawed.
Yeah, this is worrying, isn't it?
It's very worrying.
Yes, so the danger is that you're forced to go into much more popular or even populist repertoire, which removes your USP, as you say, and that's worrying.
Yes, I mean, that's it. That's the biggest challenge of all.
Yeah,
is that we exist to be different to the other orchestras. If we're thrown out of the marketplace, we will end up being exactly the same as all the other orchestras, and therefore they will, what will be the point?
Yeah, sure.
And I don't think. Well, I was about to say I don't think the BBC really understands that. They may well, and that may well be part of the long game.
Yeah. Let's look again at the whole issue of running an orchestra. You've got to audition musicians. Mm-hmm. How is that done?
Well, it's changed recently that we've started auditioning behind screens.
Oh.
To remove, if you like, well, twofold really, to remove unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. And to say to the world, we are a transparent, open, fair, welcoming organisation that wants everybody to have an opportunity to come and audition. And so we receive applications which are blind, if you like, the names and ages and so on and so forth that might identify those individuals are blanked out. So that's. And that, if you like, that's partly generally out of fairness, but it's also to try and create a more diverse workforce, if you like.
Which the BBC, to be fair, is fairly good at.
Whether it produces the goods, I really don't know. I think it's going to be a long, long haul process. But anyway, to cut a long story short, one advertises a job, people apply, we sift through the auditions, we audition some people, and then we put them through for what's called a trial. And a trial basically just means a period of work.
Right.
So they'll be offered maybe a week or 2 weeks or a month or whatever. And this can go on forever, for a long time, because if it's a principal player, you want to get the right combination of players that they're playing in, the right repertoire, so that maybe the big solos, you get to hear them playing that.
Yes.
They need to play with the chief conductor and the one principal guest conductor and so on. So it can take an awfully long time to fill some of those positions, and sometimes it happens quite quickly. But it does take a long time because you're looking for somebody who's going to fit musically, and although it doesn't sit comfortably with the inclusivity mantra, somebody who fits in socially with the orchestra, so that you have a harmonious workforce insofar as you can with the 90 different individuals.
And are these people established members of staff?
Well, they are once they join the BBC.
They are. They're not.
They come on board as staff members.
Right.
And we have a long list of freelancers as well that we call on regularly because, people might be rotated off, or they might be off sick, or they might be on maternity leave or parental leave or whatever it might be, sick leave.
But also, you've got areas in the orchestra where you need to bring in extra people. I mean,
Yeah, if we're doing a really big piece, then
percussion,
you bring in
example.
people as required. So, some of the weirder instruments, we bring in specialists.
Yeah. Will the conductor sit in on your chief conductor sit in on audition?
Sometimes they will certainly be involved in. We have what's called a panel, and the panel is made up of members of the orchestra relevant to that position.
Right.
If you like. And if it's a principal position like a principal cello or first horn or whatever it might be, then we would expect the chief conductor to be part of that. And not to have an overwhelming vote at all, but neither can the chief conductor veto. They are there to give their view to make sure that any appointment which is offered by the director is something that the chief conductor is comfortable with.
Right.
And that the team and the orchestra, by and large, are comfortable with. You can never please everybody.
No. What's the turnover in a?
There's not a lot
year?
of turnover, really. It's considered to be a good job to have. Relatively secure, pension and so on and so forth. Because we don't tour as much as some of the other London orchestras like RPO or LSO, who can be touring somewhere, several times a month. And players at a certain stage in their career, they really just want more stability. They want to spend more time at home with their families or whatever. So we've had some quite high-profile people coming to join the BBC Symphony Orchestra from those other orchestras, which has been rather good.
You do have other BBC orchestras in different parts of the country, but also you've got the Concert Orchestra in London.
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? It's there to produce a much lighter repertoire, presumably, but does that mean it's more in competition with the other orchestras in London, and therefore?
No, I would say that the Concert Orchestra particularly has a very distinctive presence and personality and output in the whole of the UK, really.
Why? How?
Because what they do, nobody else is doing for the most part.
Oh, that's interesting. Now tell me what would
Well,
be their
they will be doing a lot of soundtracks. They'll be doing, concerts with pop artists a lot of the time. And although we do that in the BBC Symphony Orchestra, we don't do it. It's not our core repertoire.
No.
We do it with our relationship with Jules Buckley, for example, in order to reach a new audience.
Right.
So we will present a strand of programming with Jules aimed at a very specific audience, which comes, fills the hall and wouldn't otherwise come to hear the BBC Symphony Orchestra. So that has been one of the ways in which we have reached out to be A, distinctive, and B, find new audiences.
Where is the Concert Orchestra based? It doesn't come under you then, this thing. It's separate.
Well, it
Completely
hasn't
separate.
had a home since they left the Hippodrome in Golders Green, when the ceiling fell down.
Oh, God.
Fortunately, in the middle of the night.
Really?
So they've been sort of nomadic. They had a base in Watford, a sort of office base, but for almost as long as I've been at the orchestra, certainly for 20 years, they've been floating around, and there's now talk about them being relocated outside London in another centre.
Really?
And that brings its own set of both opportunities and challenges and cost.
Yeah. Now, how is the orchestra paid for? It doesn't come out of Radio 3 budget?
Well, it does
presumably.
technically.
Does it?
Yeah, a certain amount of money, the license fee comes in, the BBC allocates it, some of it comes to Radio and Music, then it goes to Radio 3, and then it filters down to us.
Okay, but it also appears on television. Now, television, we see it on the first night or the last night of the Proms and a couple of other Proms that then go to BBC 4, probably. There's very little on BBC 1 or BBC 2. Why don't we see them the rest of the year?
It's a bit chicken and egg, really. In the last 20 years, I suppose, they have neglected that market very much. And now if you ask the commissioners, either they have absolutely no knowledge or awareness of whether there's an audience for our type of music, because they're not employed to be cultural commissioners.
No.
And because they're not feeding that market, they're not developing it. And so they'll try something and say, well, the viewing figures were very low. And you think, well, that's because A, you didn't market it, and B, you're not carrying on, if you like, a regular presence on television. Now, I do see some signs of that changing, but it's very much hand to mouth.
Yes.
And the BBC's investment in continuing serious culture and finding a way of reflecting it on television, because predominantly the concert format is not a very interesting thing to look at on television. But there are other ways in which you can present classical music on television. There was a very good series of programs just around the time that I joined the orchestra called Masterworks. And they were hour-long programs. And the first half of the program was about the history of the piece, the background to the piece, the research, the preparation. And then the second half was performance. And it was performance that in venues where the pieces had been first performed.
Oh, really?
So the Tallis Fantasia, it was Gloucester Cathedral. Serenade for tenor, horn and strings was in Blytheborough Parish Church. Belshazzar was in Leeds Town Hall. The joy was that they didn't have an audience, and therefore you could light them and film them in really interesting ways. And they were fantastic programs. Yeah. And they were so successful that BBC only put them out once. And because they hadn't bought the rights for anything more than one showing. I mean, this is so typical. And, now they're sort of scrabbling around trying to find interesting ways of presenting music on television.
There was a thing recently, wasn't there, on the Benjamin Britten?
Yes, The Young Person's Guide.
Yeah, The Young Person's Guide, which I thought was very well done.
Yeah.
Intercut with bits of archive film and so on. And that's the sort of thing they could do much more of.
Yeah.
And I would have thought would be very popular. Relatively popular.
Yes.
They've really got to ask themselves what they think they're there for, I must say.
I honestly don't know. I spent 23 years wondering, whether television was ever going to show any interest. And I think I can honestly say in 23 years, I never once had a meeting with any of the channel commissioners. I've never met with Susie Klein.
Yes.
Jan Young-husband, you might as well have written a note to Santa and posted it up the chimney, because nothing ever got done or made. Yeah. And the orchestra was always saying, why can't we do this? Why can't this be on telly? Why aren't television taking this? And I'd say, I have no idea. I don't know why. And so if you like, I wouldn't say that the orchestra's thinking, or the performing group's thinking, is bypassing TV, because, TV it's now morphing into this sort of on-demand service. So
yes.
It's no more sort of linear broadcasting. And so we're looking more for sort of online content.
Yes.
Which has a shelf life, a long shelf life, hopefully.
Well, you think of the things that Tom Service does, for example, with the Aurora, introducing a piece, going through it, playing bits.
I mean, there's all different ways in which you can do it and present it. You just have to invest in it. You can't just play with it and see what happens. There's got to be a long-term, well-planned, thought-through strategy, which is then supported and invested in. And it comes back to the fact that there really isn't the value in the BBC. They don't value it enough to think, well, what do we do with this?
What's, I suppose, missing, is cultural literacy.
Yes, it is cultural literacy. Seeing drama and dance on television, it's occasional, and occasional is a very weird thing. You just think, well, when can we expect it? Yeah. Well, when we've managed to scrabble together enough budget to make the next series of programs, and they're always done so cheaply.
The Proms, if you come to the Proms, because obviously the Proms does use television quite a lot.
Television uses the Proms. I wouldn't say the Proms uses telly.
Okay. If you have a television crew there, do they make demands on the orchestra which are different from, say, just the Radio 3 people?
Oh yes, they do. I mean, there's always processes of negotiation as to where cameras are placed. And in their more creative moments, they've had cameras on tracks and with rails running through the orchestra. And that all needs to be negotiated so that the orchestra, in the heat of performance, what they don't want to do is find that they're trying to play a passage, look at the conductor, there's a camera whizzing backwards and forwards in front of them. Sure. So, if you've got somebody as experienced as, say, Helen Mansfield, then that is not an issue and it won't be a problem. But it's... one of the things, again, about the orchestra is that they're so used to having TV cameras around. Unlike most other orchestras, it just doesn't bother them. So if there's a microphone, in front of Sue Monk's one, she used to play Tom Bowling at the last night of the Proms every year. With a camera in her face and a microphone at the base of the cello, she just got on with it. Yes, she was wonderful. Yes. Yeah, very much so.
Paul Watkins before that, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Now let's look a little bit more at managing the orchestra itself. What about chief conductors and conductors generally? How do you don't audition them? They presumably just come with reputations. and you know what they're like because.
Well, sometimes you know what they're like, and sometimes you don't. And the thing is, a conductor can work very well with one orchestra and absolutely not at all with another orchestra. It's like a relationship, the chemistry.
Yes.
So the job, if you like, is to look around, see who's around, speak to the people you trust, both in the orchestra itself and the agents and other concert promoters, people who do my job in other orchestras in other countries. You know, say, oh, we're looking for a conductor to do X, Y, and Z. What do you think? Or we've been recommended this person. They worked with you. How was it? So there's an awful lot of sort of research goes into trying somebody out. You know, and there will be people who will be suddenly a hot ticket. Everybody wants this person. And so you might think, okay, well, we'll take a risk and we'll try them out before we've actually sort of seen them working. But normally I would try and go and see them working. And I'd like to see them rehearsing, not just doing the concert, because the concert is fine. That's one thing. You know, an orchestra will pull together and do a great concert almost in spite of the conductor. But if you watch them rehearsing and see what the chemistry is like, the body language, the process, the progress, and then you think, yeah, I think that would work with the BBC Symphony Orchestra. And that just comes with experience, really.
Zachary Oromo is your current chief conductor. Who are your others? Who are the others that you would...
Well, Zachary was an interesting appointment because we had the previous chief conductor, the late and much missed and much loved Jiří Bělohlávek, the Czech conductor. He said that he'd had a great time with the orchestra. He was leaving to go and take over as chief music director of the Czech Phil, which he had wanted forever. So we were, you know, the hunt was on really for who might be next. And we tried various people and it didn't work out or they didn't want it or whatever and whatever. And then we were I had programmed a Sibelius cycle in the season. And I wanted 7 different conductors to do the 7 different symphonies, just to see how they would do them. And the last one we'd got left was Symphony number 3, which is not an easy one. And I said, well, let's ask Zachary Oromo. And so I asked his agent, and she said, oh, that sounds like a good idea, I'll ask him. And then she said, well, you know, he doesn't really want to do it. And I said, well, you know what, I think he should do it. And she said, well, I think he should do it as well. Anyway, to cut a long story short, she persuaded Zachary to come and do this concert. And we also did Lorna Tar with his wife, Anu Komsi, singing. And I forget what the rest of the program was now. Anyway, you know, when you've been in the business long enough, you get a sense of when there's something going on. There's a buzz. After the first rehearsal, in the break, you'd say, how's it going? Oh, it's amazing. It's extraordinary. Anyway, that just continued and continued. And I would always say to anybody when I'm mentoring, you know, young people doing management or conducting, never get married after the first date. But with Zachary, I thought this is really something extraordinary. So the concert was fabulous. It was sensational. And his agent, I know well, and she gave me a lift home we had a little bit of a dinner after the concert. And I said, listen, I don't suppose Zachary would be interested in being the next chief conductor. And she said, I don't know, I'll ask him. She said, sounds like a good idea to me. Anyway, this was in October. By December, he'd signed. And he's been there nearly 10 years, and he's signed up now through until 2026. And it is still just as great, if not better, a relationship than it was when it started.
That's very interesting.
It's just gone absolutely wonderfully well.
Could you put your finger on what he has that makes him so valuable now? Ooh.
Well, he's a Finn. He's very complicated because they are complicated people.
Yes.
But his music making is utterly authentic. And he's a string player. He knows exactly what needs to be fixed, how to fix it, how to make music, how to get the sound he wants. He just knows how to do it. And it's extraordinary. And they don't all. Although this orchestra, the BBC Symphony Orchestra, has a particular affinity for Finnish conductors and Finnish artists and Finnish composers.
Oh.
Always has done.
Really?
You know, we've worked with Esa-Pekka and Osmo Vanska and Pietro Inkinen and Susanna Malki and John Storgaards and Jukka-Pekka Saraste, who was principal guest conductor. And so, you know, we've had loads of experience working with Finns. And there's just something about it.
Curious.
Similarly with Jukka-Pekka, they love it when he comes. With John Storgaards, with Hannu Lintu, who recently came and made his debut with the orchestra, they absolutely loved it. Zachary is not easy. He can be you know, like anybody, you know, has his particular ways, but the job is always to make sure that those are, you know, managed by us, that he has everything that he needs in order to do the job that he wants, and that some of the more challenging aspects of that, which are just normal, you know, don't reach the orchestra. That they just have a good relationship with him. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And so it's the old adage, you know, of you know, on the surface it's all fine, you know, paddling like hell underneath to sort of make it all just fine. Yeah. And I've loved working with Zachary. Our relationship and our friendship has really developed in the way that, you know, I could never have hoped, really. But as it did with Hughes, as it does with Semyon Bychkov, who's another conductor who we work regularly with.
I remember interestingly introducing Jiří Bilaklavek, trouble with pronouncing his name, to the symphony chorus when he first came
I know, yes.
But he was good.
Some people, they always used to call him Jiří.
Yes.
And then people call Zachary the Sakari Aramo. And, you know, if you know Finnish, the emphasis is always on the first syllable, so Sakari Aramo.
Yes.
But that world of working with conductors and talking to them and understanding the language, you know, so that we have... And I think over the years we developed family relationships, if you like to call them that. I'm a great believer in loyalty, not sort of flipping the love around from one thing to another all the time. So people like Ed Gardner, we worked with Ed right up until the moment he got the LPO job and then couldn't work with us anymore. So probably for nearly 15 years, you know, we had a very good relationship, and I love his music making. We did loads of recordings, and there are lots of people who, you know, Ryan Wigglesworth, Ryan Bancroft, lovely relationships, Alpesh Chauhan, and of course Dalia Stasevska and Karina Kanalakis. These are artists that we've really loved working with and want to continue working with.
I seem to remember that Anne, because Anne Mackay is your producer.
Yes, absolutely.
She's been there for a very long time. But
she's predated me and she's still there.
Absolutely, still there. And as delightful as ever. What about repertoire? I'd be interested. Who decides what you play?
Broadly speaking, it's me as the sort of master planner, if you like. And I work with Anne, who programs the studio concerts predominantly, and Tom, who's the planning manager. He's the sort of artistic administrator, if you like, but he's also involved in some programming. But in terms of programming the Barbican season and feeding a lot into the Proms and creating projects that bring in new audiences, that was my responsibility. It was the bit that made the rest of the job tolerable.
Yeah.
The creative programming. So when we're doing the series of concerts, for example, with Jules Buckley, then those are designed to bring in a completely different audience and do. The programs that we do with famous authors, those bring in very different audiences and also get us broadcast on Radio 3 and on Radio 4. And so those really, you know, that job, the creative side of the job really is very much about always having your antennae sort of on the go, to think about ideas, to think about collaborations, to not let an idea stumble just because you think, gosh, that would be tricky, but wouldn't it be great if?
Yes.
You want to think, gosh, I wonder if we could do that.
But do you say, we can't do that, it just involves too many musicians, it's going to cost too much?
We've rarely done that. If it involves too many musicians, it's probably more that we can't fit it on stage rather than it costs too much.
Right.
If it's worth doing, we'll do it. When we're thinking of projects, when I'm coming up with a project or thinking of a project, the first person to speak to always is Rupert Casey, who's the stage manager. Because say to Rupert and maybe to Susanna, the orchestra manager, who is very wise, say, can this fit?
Yes.
And Rupert will, you know, they are geared up to make things happen if they possibly can. And if he says, look, it really won't, then it can't. But 90% of the time, 99% of the time probably, he'll say, yeah, I think we can make that work.
Anyway, let's talk about the other thing. I mean, you've got the singers, and they're fantastic. They're the only, fully employed choir in the
they're
country.
A full-time chamber choir. They're not an opera chorus, although they've done lots of operas with the BBC, and often with the BBC Symphony Orchestra. But they are full-time, and of course they have a very, very wide-ranging diet of repertoire, and particularly with Johnny Manners, who's now de facto the artistic director of the group.
Yeah.
He has brought an enormously wide range of repertoire to them and cultural partnerships and collaborations, which they could never have thought about in
Right.
previous years. But, Michael Emery was a wonderful producer in all my time, and when I started at the BBC, and my predecessor, Stephen Ashley King, was the then general manager, and they were lovely, lovely colleagues. And then Michael left to go to the Danish radio, and then Johnny came on board, and Rob Johnston is the choral manager, and Johnny runs it, and Sophie Janin, who's a wonderful choral conductor. What they tend to forget, funnily enough, is the huge amount. I mean, my role at the BBC Singers is very different to that at the BBC Symphony Orchestra. And the role has very much been in, if you like, transforming the singers. So in the years that I've been there, the 10 years, although now they think about, well, they don't see me that much, or I'm behind the scenes or whatever, the huge change that they've been through, having gone from 24 down to 22 down to 18, almost completely different membership, completely new staff, new range of conductors, new range of collaborators and partnerships, and a new sense of being valued by Radio 3, by the Proms particularly. That was very much the job as I saw it, which was to transform them and make them, a bit like the Symphony Orchestra, to have there's a sense of their own value and to embrace this new way of being, this new way of working with different artists, different collaborators, different groups, different ensembles, and to be confident in doing that and enjoy the fact that they can do it and do it so well.
Now, how are they different from, say, the 16 or Monteverdi or something like that?
Well, they have a different function, if you like. They are there predominantly, like the orchestras, to provide content for the BBC. So all of the performing groups, their first and foremost role, if you like, is to provide content.
Yes.
Programs, education work, concerts, whatever it might be. Now, it's very important for these groups that they don't just sit in the studio all day long churning out stuff. Their value is... One of the things that makes them special as far as the BBC is concerned is that they are consistently the most outward-facing. We see the general public en masse every single week. And not many other parts of the BBC do that, only through broadcast. On television, of course, they reach millions through what they do. But we actually are doing it in person. And so that's the role of the singers, of the chorus as well, which is a whole different proposition, being volunteers. Radio 3, the Proms, the BBC generally really values the chorus. I mean, they are a fabulous entity, and Neil Ferris is the chorus director. And, the recent first night of the Proms of Verdi Requiem, they were on top form.
They were.
And funnily enough, Neil and then manager Helen MacLeod really managed to keep hearts and minds and souls together during the pandemic, when the chorus uniquely simply couldn't come together.
Yes.
And so recruitment since the pandemic has gone up. Lots of young people, lots of new faces. And they don't know much about the old history, about the old days. A lot of those people are now gone and moved on. And it's just such a fresh, new, wonderful chorus, in my view. I think they're fantastic. And I feel very comfortable.
Yeah, and very cheap for the BBC.
Well...
No, I mean, seriously, it's a fantastic resource. It
Well,
costs BBC
you might be surprised
very
what it
little.
costs to run the chorus.
Ah, interesting.
The chorus costs between £80,000 and £100,000 a year to run, because they don't pay membership fees. We pay the chorus director, vocal coaches, pianists, hire of music, all kinds of expenses and things like that. Sure. But they are all unpaid volunteers, and they are, unlike the professionals, they can vote with their feet, so they have to be looked after and managed and valued in a different way. So we hold them to the very highest professional standards, which they want and they expect.
Absolutely.
And yet they're not professional in the technical sense. They're wonderful.
Do you think, for example, that given the way that the Proms sort of fell away for 2 or 3 years, that have now come back, would you still put on massive good things like Guru Leader?
Oh, yes.
You would schedule those things?
Very much so, because the Proms is a festival, and festivals are places where things that wouldn't normally happen should happen. Yeah. And so things like those big works, which benefit from having a big audience, because then the collective experience is so much greater. it would be like if you could fit Gurulita in the Wigmore Hall, would you do it there? Well, not really, because it's only sort of 600 people. But, when you've got 5,000 people there and there's massive chorus and orchestra and soloists and things like that. But, I mean, there were 250 chorus on stage for the Verdi Requiem. And the visual aspect of that is as important as the musical.
Stupendous. Absolutely.
Just seeing all those chorus people on this first night of the Proms 2022 particularly was very important for David and the team at the Proms to be able to say, we're back.
Now, is there a BBC orchestra still in Scotland?
Yes, the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra based in Glasgow.
Right. Now, does it have the same remit as the BBC Symphony Orchestra, but in Scotland?
Yes.
Does it have to commission new stuff?
It does lots of new music, and not just Scottish music. It does music by all kinds of composers. In Scotland there are probably three main orchestras. There's the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, the RSNO, the BBC Scottish, and the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. Apart from the one that plays for the opera, and which is a freelance band. And then similarly in Wales, the BBC National Orchestra of Wales is the only full-time symphony orchestra in the country. So they have a very specific geopolitical dimension as well, which the others don't have. So, those are very, very specific orchestras, and they're run by, lovely colleagues of mine. Yeah.
Then you've got the Phil, which is based in...
BBC Phil is based in Salford, in Media City, just on the edge of Manchester.
I don't know Bridgewater Hall very well.
It's very good hall indeed. Lovely acoustic, very good hall. They do concerts there. They do concerts in Studio 1. So is it Studio 10? I can't remember. Their new big studio at Media City. Yeah, they do concerts there. And then they're operating in a situation with the Halle, of course, and not very far away the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic and the Manchester Camerata. So that's almost as congested as London, where we're operating. We're one of 5 symphony orchestras in London, although we're the only contract symphony orchestra, interestingly. Yeah.
And then, of course, Birmingham has a wonderful hall.
Mm-hmm. And a wonderful orchestra.
Very good acoustic, and also
outstandingly good acoustic.
I've only sung in it. I've never been to a concert
it's very, very good.
Yeah, and then if you take London, we've got the Albert Hall, we've got the Festival Hall, we've got the Barbican. They're not world-class venues, are they? Like, for example...
Well, they're world-class in the content that goes in them.
Oh, the content that goes in them is different.
The halls...
Because you've got the LSO after all and so on.
People talk about the Concertgebouw as being an absolutely fabulous acoustic. It's not. It's very complex and difficult. The music for Ryan is beautiful, but it's not always straightforward. So these halls are... you have to... if the Barbican had just a little bit more bloom, I think it would be absolutely ideal. I like the clarity. I like the sound. I've always felt comfortable at the Barbican. Yes. When I'm at the Festival Hall, I don't get the sense that the sound wraps around me in the way that I would like. No. It sort of seems to exist down at one end. Yes. But that's just, I've sat in the same seat at the Barbican for 23 years, so I or 22 years rather. Yes. I'm used to it. I know what I'm listening for. Sure.
One of the things about the Barbican, which is just sort of obsession of mine, there is no organ.
No, exactly, and whether or not they put one in the refurbishment program, which is on the cards,
is it?
Remains to be seen.
Because the thing is, it's solid concrete, isn't it? Behind the orchestra, there's no way of opening the thing up, and you'd have to do that.
Well, yes and no. I mean, you just need to restructure it. Really, it's behind the orchestra is backstage, so you just need to sort of accommodate the orchestra somewhere else and push it back. Yeah. But I say that not being an architect, although I've in my 23 years at the Symphony Orchestra, I do believe I'm the person who knows most about the history of a new venue for the Maida Vale than anybody else, because I've been there longer. So I've had my fair share of conversations with architects.
Okay, so you're obviously commissioning things too.
Yep.
Does Radio 3 pay for the commissions?
Yep. We bid for commissions, if you like, into the central commissioning pot.
Right.
And sometimes commissions come other ways as well. And we do co-commissioning sometimes, or increasingly. We work very closely with the Barbican, co-producing projects that we couldn't necessarily do on our own. And that's become a really, not only an important part of our output and our relationship, but a really stimulating one to be able to put our heads together and do projects that simply wouldn't have happened had the Barbican not been there, or for them, had the BBC Symphony Orchestra not been there.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of Barbican audiences, I mean, I remember the old festival hall audiences where you did a concert, and there would be two men and a dog, probably that dog there. It'd be very, very small audiences, very often, for really very good concerts. Something went wrong then. I don't know why it was so.
Well, if you look back through the history of the orchestra, not getting huge audiences is part of its history.
Yes.
But in a way, that's not necessarily the point. The point is to...
Not if the broadcast is the important...
The broadcast is the important thing,
yes.
the public thing, and sometimes you'll say to and I always say to the orchestra up front, it's going to be very light tonight, because I don't want them to have a nasty surprise to step out there and see the dog and the two men. Yes. But to say to everybody, and they understand why it is, because the programme is what it is and it's peculiar or it's weird or whatever it might be. The point is that however few people are there, they are there because they want to be there. Yes. They're not there under any kind of false pretense. We thought it was Tchaikovsky and it's Kurtag, what's the deal? And so we've had some of the most rewarding experiences just being there with some of those smaller audiences. But then, you might put on something like John Adams and it's absolutely packed. Or Mark Turnage and it's rammed, and... Yeah.
Do you think audiences have got bigger then, in the last 10 years? Or during your time, shall we say?
Yeah, I think,
Have they got more sophisticated?
The
broader taste?
I think so. I think the old cliche about, the classical music audiences are getting older and they're dying and all that kind of thing, I think that's a lot of hogwash, really. The accessibility of classical music and getting it out there. I mean, the performing groups in this country, the BBC no less of them, we try everything we can to make it as accessible, as affordable, as available to everybody as we possibly can. We are not helped by the BBC in that, I have to say. We do it in spite of the BBC in many cases. The BBC thinks, well, you need to get bigger audiences. Well, why don't you help promote it more? But you don't. Yes. They want something without actually having to do anything for it, and that's very frustrating. So we do our best, and we do what we do.
But the worst thing is if they don't value it because they don't understand.
Well, that's the worst thing of all, that they don't value it, and they will let it fall apart.
Yeah. But they've got interestingly, when the charter comes up for renewal, they're suddenly going to discover that these things are important.
Well, I don't know it. I always used to say rather cynically that every 10 years, the charter renewal would come up and the Radio 3 would be dusted off as the epitome of public service broadcasting and the orchestras playing what they do, and all the statistics and everything like that, and then we're put back in a drawer again for the next 10 years, beaten up, having our funding cut. Yes. I mean, it's no understatement to say that the majority of my time was spent in justifying our existence internally, not externally. The world outside knows what we do, in the landscape or the ecology, if you like, of musical ecology of the UK and indeed of the world. The BBC Symphony Orchestra has a very clear place and a clear role, and we fit very comfortably in that. But inside the BBC, they don't really know what we do. No. They're not interested. They're not really curious. They don't really support it. They just constantly cut it. Yeah. And that's really why I decided to stop after a while. I just thought,
really sad, yeah.
The Stratford project has been a really good example of how difficult a project has been to work on. And at times it was toxic to the point of tears almost. I just thought I simply have no idea why I'm doing this. And I love the orchestra, and I've loved it for as long as I can remember, since I first started. And they are a wonderful group of people. Yeah. But the BBC is a very difficult place to work when you're in classical music particularly. I agree. So I thought, you know what, I can go and do what I do somewhere else. Absolutely. And hopefully it'll be valued more.
Yeah. Do you actually make any money with these concerts? I mean, if you've got a full Barbican or a full...
No.
It always needs subsidy.
Yeah, every orchestra and every opera company and every ballet company in the country will tell you that it's, in the broadest sense of the word, it's cost recovery. Because, the public service aspect means that we charge a certain amount and we charge a reasonable, fair market price for the tickets, which sits in what other orchestras charge, because we don't want to undercut. But, the cost of running an orchestra is enormous. The salaries, the rehearsals and so on and so forth. And so the the income, even when it's packed. All you can hope is that you make the income target which you predicted.
Yeah. Because Nick Kenny was saying, it doesn't really make any money, the Proms, even though it's packed out. And I mean, it is pretty much packed out, isn't it?
Well, they have quite... I mean, it'll be interesting to see how it is this season. But the people I talk to, I say to them, you know what, actually the BBC invest in the Proms. It doesn't cover all its costs. No. And they go, don't be ridiculous. Of course it does. But it doesn't. It costs far more than people have any sense of. And ticket sales might bring in 3.5, 4 million, whatever, but it probably costs 7 to put it on.
Yeah.
But there again, it's valued because of the broadcast that it generates, the TV broadcast, the overseas rights, and because it's the Proms.
Yeah.
But the ambition of the BBC for the Proms is constantly that to do it more cheaply, to sell more tickets, to be more populist. And so those big, weird, unusual events that the Proms used to do, they're fewer and further between, which is a shame. But I think David Pickard, who's the director, does the most fabulous job. I think he's a really outstanding director of the Proms, and it's been a joy working with him.
Good. Thank you very much for doing this, Paul. I found that really very, very interesting.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's lovely to talk about it and actually to be asked what I think about it.
Well, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I thought that was great fun.